The NFL draft is just 21 days away. In 3 weeks' time, Brad Holmes, Dan Campbell, and the rest of the Detroit Lions organization will have to make a choice that will impact the team's future for decades. And today, we're going to get a look at their draft strategy. Take a look at their top 30 visits. Take a look at the players they're showing interest in and talk about whether or not they could become Detroit Lions and the likelihood that we see some of these players wearing Honolulu blue next season. And for all intents and purposes, the Lions have kind of dealt their hand each year when it comes to their top 30 visits. In 2024, the Detroit Lions hosted players like Giovanni Manu, Nate Lynn, Terrion Arnold, Ennis Rakestraw, and Sione Vaki, all of whom, of course, ended up being Detroit Lions last season. And even the year prior in 2023, the Detroit Lions hosted Hendon Hooker, Adrian Martinez, Ronnie Bell, Antoine Green, Sam Laporta, and Brian Branch, all of whom, of course, ended up being on the Detroit Lions roster, and many of which have had massive and significant impacts on said roster over the last 2 seasons. And this year, the Detroit Lions haven't filled out the entirety of their list. They haven't had every single visit of their top 30, but they have had six, and there are guys that are very interesting, players that are going to be scattered all across the different rounds of the NFL draft, and players that are going to be interesting to keep an eye on this year. Those players include Chaz Cambless, the linebacker from Georgia, Lan Larison, the running back from UC Davis, Gray Zabel, an offensive lineman from North Dakota State University, Josiah Stewart, the edge rusher from Michigan, Ruben Highplate, the linebacker from Maryland, and Shamar Stewart, the edge rusher from Texas A&M. Now, some of these players will go very early in the NFL draft, like Shamar Stewart. Some of them will be likely day two selections, like Josiah Stewart, and some of them may very well go undrafted, like Lan Larison. But each and every one of them now has a connection to the Detroit Lions. And if history has taught us anything over the last 2 years, at least one of these players will end up in Honolulu blue this season. And we're going to talk about all of them. Now, starting off with, I think, the least likely, or at least the lowest drafted player, Lan Larison, running back from UC Davis, a player that stands at 6 foot even, 215 pounds, run a 4.46 40-yard dash at his pro day, 35-inch vertical, and overall is a good, not great Division II athlete. Last season, he had 284 carries for 1,465 yards and 17 touchdowns. The year prior, he also broke 1,000 yards and 13 touchdowns on the season, and has been a really good, productive running back over his entire career at UC Davis. A player that does play smaller competition, a player that has put up really good numbers and is a decent athlete, could end up being on the Detroit Lions practice squad, could end up fighting for that last running back spot on the roster. However, with the Detroit Lions, of course, having Jahmyr Gibbs, having David Montgomery, re-signing Craig Reynolds, and of course, having Sione Vaki on a 3-year contract, the likelihood that Davis makes the roster is unlikely, right? Lan Larison is probably not going to be a Detroit Lion for the entire season, but I do think he could be here for the preseason. He could be on the preseason 90-man roster, could even make it on the practice squad, beating out players like Jamar Jefferson from last year. And even though, of course, he likely will not play, we'll never see him on the field for the offense, I think he is a good running back. I think he shows a lot of promise from being a small school type of player. And you never know. You might find a diamond in the rough, and he may turn into your future running back 3. But of course, he will be a late round pick if he is selected at all. And especially in a draft class that is so incredibly loaded at running back, the likelihood is not high that he will be drafted this season. But undrafted free agency is a thing for a reason, and he could join the Lions from that standpoint. Chaz Cambless, the linebacker from Georgia, 6'2", 250 pounds. Last season had 40 tackles for the Georgia Bulldogs, 10 TFLs, 6.5 sacks, and a fumble recovery. Now, despite the pretty high amount of sacks, he's not really a pass rusher. He is an off-ball linebacker that blitzes quite a bit. The Lions have shown a ton of progress on their linebacking core. They've put a lot of capital into it. Right now, they have guys, of course, at the top like Jack Campbell, Alex Anzalone, and Derek Barnes. A little bit below that, you have guys like Malcolm Rodriguez. You have, a bunch of different players that they brought back. Anthony Pittman's been brought back, along with a number of other players. Grant Stewart was a free agency signing this year. So the linebacking core is pretty full, but they usually take about 10 to 12 linebackers into the preseason, and Chaz Cambless could be a player that makes the roster from that standpoint, either makes it to the practice squad or potentially is one of those shocking players that makes the roster as a special teamer and just is able to contribute from that standpoint. And I think Ruben Highplay is a very similar player, right? 6'1", 225 pounds, a little bit lighter, but has 66 tackles, 7 TFLs, an interception, and 1 pass defended. Again, much more of an off-ball linebacker, which isn't something the Lions necessarily need, but having quality depth, finding these diamonds, finding these role players in the later rounds of the NFL draft is never going to be a bad thing for your NFL franchise. And if the Detroit Lions can get one of these players and add them to the special teams, I think it makes the linebacking core deeper, it makes them stronger, and overall, I think improves the special team quality all around. Now, getting into a couple of players that actually could make the active roster and you could see playing significant snaps, Gray Zabel is the first one that stands out. 6'6", 305 pounds, has played all 5 positions on the offensive line from left to right tackle and everything in between. He is a really interesting prospect with a 90.4 Pro Football Focus grade. He is one of the highest graded offensive linemen in the NFL draft. He played 453 pass blocking snaps a season ago, had 1 sack allowed and just 2 quarterback hits, but is a player that, again, is incredibly versatile, is coming from a system that has put several NFL linemen across the league over the last number of years, and just overall is a good quality offensive lineman. This could be a sleeper pick for the Lions at 28, or especially if they trade out of the 28th overall pick into the early second round, that would be the prime opportunity to select Gray Zabel from North Dakota State. Now, of course, the downsides is he played in a small conference, he plays at a smaller school, doesn't play a lot of NFL caliber pass rushers, but he has the size, he has the athleticism, he has the traits. He looked really good at the Senior Bowl and just overall was very impressive in the pre-draft process, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Lions select him. He seems like a Dan Campbell type of player from his mentality to his pass blocking to his run blocking. He is a nasty player on the offensive line, and I do think he could be a great pickup for the Lions early in the draft to cement the legacy of that offensive line, keep them young, keep them competitive, and really just overall keep them as one of the top young units across the league. Josiah Stewart, pass rusher from Michigan, 6'2", 245 pounds. Last season at 13 tackles for loss, 8.5 sacks, and 2 forced fumbles in the Big Ten. Now, he's not the most athletic of players. He's not the quickest, the twitchiest, the bendiest of players, but he is a very relentless player. He is a relentless pass rusher, brings good power, brings good bend, and I wouldn't say is necessarily a specialist in any particular style of pass rush, but is a good, well-rounded player. I think 60 would maybe be a little too rich for what he is, but I don't think he'll make it to 102. So he's one of those players that you could potentially reach on at 60, right? It would be a little bit of a reach from the standpoint of I think there are better pass rushers that will be available at the time. But when you look at his motor, you look at his abilities, you look at his production, you look at, the mindset that he plays with when it comes to both stopping the run as well as rushing the passer, he screams Detroit Lions to me. He is a player that I could very much see the Detroit Lions taking in the NFL draft, whether it be at 60, whether he makes it to 102, whether they trade back into the mid 70s to early 80s and select Josiah Stewart. This is a player that if I were willing to put money on it, of all of these players is probably top 2 in terms of could be a Detroit Lion. I think the value could be there. The position of need is there. He's kind of in that second to third tier of edge rusher. So he could be the second player at that position this year for the Detroit Lions. And if you get a player in the early rounds and then you get, say Josiah Stewart at 70, at 80 with a trade back, I think you're looking at a really good player and really good value for the Detroit Lions in a depth position. And then you have Shemar Stewart, a player that I am not incredibly high on. 6'6", 290 pounds with a perfect 10.0 RAS score, meaning he is one of the most athletically gifted defensive ends that the NFL Combine has ever seen. He profiles very similarly to Myles Garrett from size, weight, speed, athleticism, and arm length, all things that are incredibly important at the position. The problem is that over his last 3 years, Shemar Stewart has just 4.5 career sacks and 12 career tackles for loss. In an SEC that has good talent and has good offensive linemen, Shemar Stewart never broke out. He never had a good season. He never statistically put everything together in order for him to be a top tier pass rusher. And as much as people are going to look at it and say, well, he's got all the tools, he's got all the traits, he just needs better coaching, he needs to put these moves together, he needs to learn a little bit more. The problem is he hasn't grown in 3 years at Texas A&M. He is the same player today that he was coming out of high school, and that is a good player, a decent run defender, but a poor pass rusher, a player that can't finish plays, a player that can't get to the quarterback consistently. And even though he had 33 pressures a season ago, he had a forced fumble and 2 fumble recoveries, he does have a very high motor. He's just an athletic Josh Paschal. He is a more athletically gifted Josh Paschal. And while it's true, if you somehow get Shamar Stewart, right, and you teach him how to use his hands properly, and you teach him how to use his feet properly, and you teach him different pass rushing moves, and you teach him all the different aspects of being a great defensive lineman, and he picks those things up quickly, sure, he could be a really good defensive lineman. He could be an excellent pass rusher. But those players are usually the exception, right? The Danielle Hunters are the exception, not the rule. The Javon Walker is, the exception, not the rule from Georgia for the Jacksonville Jaguars. But more often, you get guys like Rashawn Gary, who never really live up to the hype. You get guys that never put their pass rush moves together, never really click as far as pass rushers go. And if you can't get 5 sacks in 3 years in the SEC, how are you going to put together a 10-sack season in the NFL? How are you going to become a reliable, consistent pass rusher against, Christian Darrisaw, against Darnell Wright, against, Tristan Wirfs, against, Trent Williams, against Lane Johnson? Those are all players and all teams that the Detroit Lions have to go through next season. If you can't get past SEC players, how are you going to get past future Hall of Famers? How are you going to get past Pro Bowlers and All Pros and really good offensive linemen if you can't do it at the collegiate level? Now, coaching is a big thing. Development curves are not the same for every player, and I absolutely understand that. At his ceiling, Shamar Stewart can be a great player, but I just don't think the Lions have time to wait around. Now, Shamar Stewart likely won't be on the board by the time the Detroit Lions pick, meaning it could be indicating the Lions are willing to move up for a pass rusher, but I do think it's very interesting, and he is a player that will get a first-round pick, does have a first-round grade from many fans, many media members, and many NFL teams, and I think he'll be an interesting player to watch, but I don't think he's the right player for the Detroit Lions. So, in conclusion, will every player make the roster? No. Will every player get drafted or selected? No. But the likelihood and the history will tell you that one of these players will end up being a Detroit Lion, whether it be Shamar Stewart in the first, Josiah Stewart on day 2, Landon Larison in UDFA. It doesn't matter, right? One of these players will likely end up in Honolulu Blue, so keep an eye on them. Keep an eye out for players that the Lions are continuing to interview in their top 30 process, and in 3 weeks, we'll find out what the Detroit Lions decide. So with that being said, let me know down in the comments below your opinions of the top 30 visits. I'm very curious to hear your guys' opinions. Do you like the top 30 visits? Of the top 30 visits, what players do you want to see? I'd be very curious to hear your guys' opinions down in the comments below. But with all of that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, and as always, go Lions.